Class, when we last spoke, we talked a bit about how we go from sugar to ATP. And when we do that, we release water and we release carbon dioxide as a waste product. Now, in this chapter, in this lecture, this content is on photosynthesis. This is how we go from carbon dioxide and water and turn that into carbohydrates that we can eat. This is where the foundation of the food web is, the foundation of all life on Earth, and that is photosynthesis. All right, let's get this to work. Here we go. Now, photosynthesis photosynthesis is basically the foundation of the food web. I guess it's not chapter 8 in our current textbook, but photosynthesis is the process by which CO2 is taken up by plants or algae and then turned into carbohydrates, and it's part of the carbon cycle. That's what this is showing. This is from a later chapter in the book, but it's part of the carbon cycle. For example, coal. Coal in the ground is nothing but sugars that were turned into wood by ancient trees and then fossilized, basically. So that's old CO2 from the atmosphere that has been turned to coal, and then we burn it and it goes back into the atmosphere again. So photosynthesis, a vital part not only of just how we live, but also even part of our economy. Photosynthesis is responsible for life on Earth as we know it. Around 2 billion years ago or so, well, let's look back here. Back in time, there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere, and somewhere around 3.5, 3.6 billion years ago, photosynthesis evolved, and it quickly changed the atmosphere, creating what we call the oxygen revolution. This is when the atmosphere changed from an oxygen poor to an oxygen rich environment, and that changed the trajectory of evolution. Part of the reason it changed evolution is that organisms could now extract a lot of energy from sugar because of cellular respiration. Skip that, that's an old slide. Okay, so a few learning goals today. Describe the inputs and outputs and locations of the major phases of photosynthesis and some of the experiments that led to our understanding of photosynthesis. Compare and contrast photosynthesis to respiration. Now remember, you have guided reading questions that I provide. Hopefully I've uploaded them by the time you watch this video. These are a few of the questions you'll need to answer. Distinguish between heterotrophs and autotrophs. I'll let you do that by reading the book. That'll be on the test. You need to know it. Where are chloroplasts located? What are the parts of a chloroplast? These are the kinds of things you can write answers to or draw while you read your textbook. Now let's go to one of the early experiments. This is an experiment by a guy named von Helmont. And he wanted to understand how plants worked. So what he did is he took a tree and he put it in a pot. That pot had almost 92 kilograms of soil. And the tree weighed 2.3 kilograms. Okay? Then he let it grow for a while. And then he measured the tree in the soil again. And the tree was 77 kilograms. His hypothesis would be that the soil would now weigh, I'm just going to rough this out, weigh something like 15 kilograms, right? Because he thought that the roots of the tree eat the soil, and that's how the tree gets bigger. But what he actually found was that his hypothesis was incorrect. The soil barely lost any weight at all. The tree gained all kinds of weight, but the soil lost barely any weight at all. And he says, that's weird. Where did all this new mass come from? And the answer comes in the fact that it came from the air. The air fed the tree, sort of. We'll talk more about what happened in a bit. Then later on, Joseph Priestley does an experiment, puts a mouse in a jar with a candle. The mouse dies. I bet you know why. What did the candle use up? Oxygen. Why do you breathe oxygen? Why do you need oxygen? You better be able to answer that. Okay, next experiment. He put a candle in a jar with a mouse along with a plant, and everything stayed alive, right? The oxygen remained, the candle still burned, this plant was releasing something into the air that allowed the critter to live and the candle to burn. We now know that that is oxygen. So von Helmont demonstrated that something in the plant was not produced from the soil but came from the air. That experiment I showed you a second ago. Joseph Priestley noticed that vegetation adds something to the air. Something was added by that plant that kept the mouse alive. Notice when these folks lived, the 1600s and the 1800s. Then there's another experiment, and a scientist named Jan Ingenhousz, and he comes up with a hypothesis. Now, this is a wrong hypothesis, but that's okay. Wrong hypotheses are how we move forward in science. We eliminate the things that are false. And he proposed that plants carry out a process that split CO2 into carbon and oxygen gas. That makes sense, right? You know, CO2, maybe photosynthesis breaks this up into carbon and oxygen. And that makes sense, but that's not what happens. But he came up with something that could be tested. And once it was tested, it was found to be false. But then it's like, oh, it's not CO2 that split. You know what it really is? H2O. H2O is split to release oxygen gas, the gas that we breathe. This is where the air we breathe comes from. So, who photosynthesizes? Who does this process? Well, plants, the kingdom Plantae, but also algae, which are protists. You know, they're not plants. They are plant-like, but they're not plants. Also, single-celled eukaryotes. So plants and algae are multicellular eukaryotes. Single-celled eukaryotes like Euglena, and also some different kinds of bacteria, like cyanobacteria and purple sulfur bacteria. So plants do it, algae can do it, single-celled eukaryotes, some single-celled eukaryotes can do it, as well as some bacteria can photosynthesize. They take in sunlight energy and they make food. Basically, photosynthesis is going from global warming to candy because we go from CO2 to C6H12O6, or sugar, right? And that's what this process does. And it's an endergonic reaction. So it does that with the power of the sun to fuel it. Whereas cellular respiration was more of an exergonic reaction. We break things down. We did build ATP, which is endergonic, but overall we lost more energy as heat. So breaking things down, like breaking sugar down, is a catabolic process that releases energy. Okay, so let's look at where these processes take place. So here is so the organism in this case is a, what kind of tree is that? That's a redbud tree. So here's a leaf of a redbud tree. That's an organ. In that organ are tissues, right? So here are the tissues, and in those tissues are cells, and in those cells are organelles. So that's what we're looking at here. So here's the tissues. So let me just show you. In a leaf, there is an upper layer of epidermis and a lower layer of epidermis. And then inside the leaf, there are these tall cells like this, and these other cells that are spaced out like this, with some spaces between them. And there are these weird cells in the epidermis that have gaps between them sometimes. I'm going to change that to blue. This tissue here is called the mesophyll. And this is where photosynthesis happens, okay? And this gap, this opening here, is called a stoma. Plural is stomata. And this is where gases come in and out of the leaf, okay? So this tissue made of a couple different, well, a couple tissues really, but we're just going to call it mesophyll. You can learn more about it in Bio 2. This is where chlorophyll is found. So let's zoom in. So here's the stuff I've drawn. And also, of course, in here are veins with xylem and phloem, which conduct sugars and water, which you'll learn more about in Bio 2, the veins of a leaf. But let's zoom in on one of these mesophyll cells. That's what they have right here. Mesophyll cells are full of these green organelles. So let's zoom into one of those organelles, and here is a chloroplast. A chloroplast is a structure that has a couple of layers of membranes. It has an outer membrane it has another inner membrane, and then it has another layer of membrane inside that kind of looks like, I stink at drawing it, but it looks like a bunch of coins stacked on top of each other, and it's connected to other stacks of these coins. Okay, so this is the outer membrane. This is the inner membrane, and this is called the thylakoid membrane. And this area right here is the intermembrane space. I'm just abbreviating those because they're similar terms to the ones we learned about with the mitochondria. And this liquid in here that the thylakoid membrane is in is called the stroma. Not to be confused with stoma or stomata. The stroma is this liquid. Lots of enzymes and things in there. Now this thylakoid membrane has pockets inside of it. You can see that here, called the thylakoid space. I'll circle that word right here, thylakoid space. That would be like this right here, thylakoid space, like these pockets inside. And what that is just kind of like the sort of like the matrix in a mitochondria. It's the inside where the membrane's all folded up. There's a space in there. You can see it clearly there. Just to give you a bit more terminology, these stacks that look like coins are called grana, or singular granum, right? And these single coins, because these things look like stacks of coins, right? This inner membrane, this thylakoid membrane. The whole stack is called a granum. And each single coin-looking structure is called a thylakoid. Okay? So that's what these organelles are, and there's hundreds of them packed into a single mesophyll cell, so one of these cells in the leaf. Here we can see it a little closer. You can see the thylakoid space, that pocket inside there, inside the thylakoid membrane. Each fold that looks like a coin is called a thylakoid. Each stack of these coins is called a granum. Plural would be grana, like this, grana. You can see the outer membrane, the inner membrane. The intermembrane space is the space between the inner and outer membrane. Now, this is another case of redox reactions. In this case, carbon dioxide, CO2, is reduced to glucose. Water is oxidized to oxygen. It's going to be broken apart. So where does the oxygen released from photosynthesis come from? I bet you know the answer to that. It comes from H2O, right? Compare the absorption spectrum for chlorophyll A as well as B as that of carotenoids. We haven't talked about that, but if you read your chapter like you should do before you watch me talk, you could answer number 7 on your own right now. See if you can. If you can't, shame on you. Read your book. All right, here we go. Here's another set of questions that I expect you to be able to answer from your guided reading. The function of these different parts, what they're made of, or I'm sorry, what they do, where they're at, okay? Things for you to be able to do on your own. Learning, one thing I've learned as a teacher is I can't really teach you anything. You have to learn, so you have to make use of what I say and do, and your textbook, and you have to pull information out and learn it. I can talk to you all day, and it won't make you learn. You have to work to learn. That's why I've created these questions. All right, so let's talk about light. Light is what drives this process, and light is a part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light is just a small part of that spectrum. And if we measure how far apart the waves are in a beam of light, that's where this wavelength measurement comes from. Wavelengths that are real short and close together have a lot of energy in them, down here in the purple. Wavelengths that are farther apart have less energy. They're in the red spectrum. And if you go beyond this, like blue light, you go beyond blue, you get into ultraviolet. That has a lot of energy in it. That can cause skin cancer and things, right? X-rays have even more energy, so on and so forth. It's visible light that is going to drive photosynthesis, the same kind of light we can see. We'll pick up with that in the next video.